welcome everyone to our June crowdcast. I am very happy to present our guest today, Luke Ranieri, who is coming to us from Pennsylvania and is just a sensation on YouTube with all of his Latin, Greek, and language learning content, and is perhaps the best wearer of a geology hat that I have seen outside of actual dinosaur digs. So,
Yeah, a hat that I proudly wore in Jackson Hole quite a bit, actually, when I was doing my geology work, actually. Excellently named town.
Well, the direction of naming goes more the other way.
Ah, you're right. That's one of those Romulus is what gave the name to Rome kind of backwards etymologies.
A little bit. Yeah, when I was a kid, Wyoming was the only place you would meet kids named Jackson, but now it has spread like wildfire. Every time that I'm at a Target anywhere, there's someone screaming at some 3-year-old Jackson. So, oh well. Well, Luke, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about how you came to be where you're at in terms of your internet presence and what you are aiming to do with all of your different channels and programs?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I've tried several things and done a lot of things that I'm proud to have been doing, including being a military pilot for a few years now. But always throughout the years, way back since 2005, when I was a sophomore in university, I got a hold of a great book that I had mentioned, that Lingua Latina per se illustrata, which teaches you basically how to read Latin to fluency, and it only uses Latin. It's a really interesting, amazing book, and I'd recorded the audio for it years ago on YouTube, and that's where I kind of started because I was really interested in kind of combining things. I already spoke Italian at the time, and speaking a modern language, as you know, that's related to the ancient language that you're studying and interested in, gives you some insight. You're a Norwegian speaker, of course, and that gives you a lot of kind of insight, especially with the really interesting dialects in Norwegian, for example. That this is, I can see what the old or ancient language was like by comparison. A lot of people that deal probably with I don't know much about Old Norse except from what I learned from your channel, but I certainly know from the Latin and ancient Greek world, very few people in classics, wherever they are, learn a modern language that's closely related to it, especially if they're, say, Northern European or speak a Northern European language. A lot of the studies of the classical languages are in the U.S., Germany, England, quite a bit in Italy, and certainly plenty in Greece, but for the most part, you don't see, like, Italians don't learn modern Greek to help them with ancient Greek. Greeks don't learn Italian to help them with Latin if they bother to learn Latin, that, barbarian language. So what I found for myself was this combination. Okay, I have fluency in a language that's descended from Latin, and I want to make the way I want to speak Latin because, of course, I want to speak Latin. Why would you learn a language and not want to speak it? It's sort of where I came from, which was, I realized later, was crazy until I found other crazy people like myself who wanted to do the same thing. And that was really it, to want to be really excited about phonology, ancient pronunciation varieties, and I used to be much more draconian, I think, about, like, oh, it was pronounced this way. But now that I've done all this really fun research on the different dialects and pronunciations and the different periods and different centuries and different geographies, it's kind of like, whatever, pronounce Latin however you want, it's fine. But because why not? But certainly there's all those kinds of fun controversies, just like where say Icelanders, for example, are vehement about the pronunciation of the older version of Icelandic being just like the modern one, and then of course we know better, but it's that kind of thing, trying to convince Italians and Greeks, like, well, not quite, a little bit different. So that's sort of what I've been doing for the years, just fascinated by it and wanting to try to communicate with my videos and other content. Like, yeah, you can learn these languages too. They can be hard, but they don't have to be that hard.
And to give us kind of a bird's eye view of your different channels, you have Polymathy, you have Scorpio Martianus.
That's pretty much it.
What can we find on the different ones?
Yeah, I have a couple others. Like, I have one which is just called Luke Ranieri, and I don't really do anything except maybe write comments on videos with it. I don't do much with it. And I have one for Japanese that I haven't added to for years because I got to live in Japan, and from 2012 to 2015, I was stationed there in the Air Force. So I wanted to make a lot of videos about, because I learned Japanese relatively quickly in about 3 to 6 months, because I found just the right tools. I think, I'm going to make a whole video series and put it on YouTube. And then I never did, because then I got back into the Latin and Greek stuff. And so, yeah. So really just Scorpio Martianus, which is just Latin and ancient Greek content, and Polymathy, where I wanted to talk about all kinds of things. I wanted to talk about all languages, but I found that people just kept coming for Latin and Greek stuff. So I've very
Hmm.
narrowly focused on that for now, but I'm really interested in aviation and space and technology. Is why I call it Polymathy, because I am aspire to be a polymath, I guess, to be interested in many things and study them and to talk about them. So eventually
Of course.
I may do that, but for now I'm going to concentrate on Latin and Greek, where I get to speak English though, on Polymathy.
Right. And you got really, really quickly to that Loki episode with the spoken Latin.
I'm
That
grateful
was
to fans. Yeah, like I like waking up at I'm still kind of on Italy time, so I've been waking up at 4 a.m., which is good.
hmm,
And I just like being up early and working out, and it's just convenient. So if someone sent me a message right away who was, I think, in Europe, and they'd already seen the episode, say, "Hey, there's Latin in this episode," and I went on and I found the scene and I'm like, I can knock this out in 6 hours, and there it was. Yeah.
wow. Oh, I mean, I've knocked out videos about that fast too. But man, I was impressed. Um,
Oh, thanks.
and actually, I was I was not as dismayed as I thought that I was going to be at the Latin in it. Like I always sort of have this preparatory cringe anytime I'm about to see some popular culture presentation of any ancient language or ancient anything. But it was not awful.
Do cringe is appropriate. How much have you suffered of Vikings, I wonder? Or do you not speak about that openly?
Uh, Zero. I have actually never seen even a moment of it. Um, however, I am on the DVD extras for the season 2 DVD set.
Really? Did you advise
Yeah,
at all on the show?
nope. They've never asked me anything, but for whatever reason, I'm in this extra thing on the season 2 DVD set. I told them I had never seen the show, and they said that's okay.
Great. Just made a
All right.
video for them talking about the subject, or
Yeah, I'm just one of the talking heads.
that's great.
But they could have done what everybody wants to do and just run, Google Translate, because there is Google Translate for Latin. Um,
As I
but
have
as soon
learned.
as I heard, yes, as soon as I heard mihi nomen, I thought, oh, there's some effort went into this. Like that's something you wouldn't expect, right? That's
Yeah.
okay, right? I give some points just for effort.
Yeah. And I think Tom Hiddleston, I assume he probably translated, honestly. I didn't check, but it's because he's so good at the both Latin and Greek, he could easily, I think, translate all those things as he did. I just know, like from his interviews, based on like the stuff he said, yeah, he probably could easily have translated that, or they got someone else and he fixed it. But I thought he was, like I said in the video, I thought he was really on the ball.
I am impressed, yeah. Um, much more so than I expected to be. I still haven't actually even seen, much of the Marvel universe, but that was a moment of light.
Yeah,
So,
I felt really remember I was in grad school. I didn't care. But I was in an a cappella group. My friend Ace, Mene Acevedo, he was like, "No, you gotta watch, man. It was so cool. No, you gotta watch from the beginning." I was like, "Okay." And I started watching them, and I started seeing the teasers at the end, and I started to realize, oh, this is like ancient Greek play cycles. Everything's based on the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they're all tying them all together, just like all the like Sophocles and Euripides, and they're all basing all of these stories as this broad connected mythology. And so, yeah, I decided, all right, I'll make the point to watch all of them, and I watched all the way through Endgame. I haven't watched Loki at all. I just saw that one scene, and that's it. But it's kind of like it's kind of like our modern mythology, and it's okay. Yeah, there's just a lot of nice little stuff in there. But and also to be more to try to be connected with our times, because I don't know, I think like future stuff, like Mars stuff, and of course you and I like to think the old and ancient world. So I try to be a little bit connected with the popular culture.
that is a generous and charitable perspective. I also agree that it is basically fulfilling a role much like modern myth. And I think Star Wars actually is an excellent example, saying it's essentially the same place in our society as something like the Iliad or the Saga of the Volsungs once was. I mean,
Mm,
I would always make this example to students. Um, I would always say, well, the Saga of the Volsungs to the Norse is what Star Wars is to you, right? And as much as I can come into the classroom breathing like Darth Vader, right, doing the thing, and they know I'm setting myself up as a bad guy. I said, in the same way, in the Norse culture, references to the Volsungs can be just that subtle, but people will catch them the same way that in classical culture you'd expect references to the Iliad to be subtle, but probably caught by anybody who has pretensions of being an intellectual.
exactly.
So let's talk a little bit more about your language learning while I open up the floor to questions from anybody in our audience here. By the way, folks, if you type just on the regular chat screen on the right side, it's usually easier for me to see than if you put it in ask a question at the bottom. Although I can, I guess, see either way. Um, you are clearly a talented and experienced language learner. Do you have a bird's eye view? I'll use that expression again. Of how you go about tackling a new language, because this is something people ask me about quite a lot.
That's a really good question, and I think it's unfortunately it's very different for each language for two reasons. One is availability of materials. Like
Hmm.
for any modern language, it's amazing what you can do with the internet. Especially if you can, like, I just started doing something I never had thought of. Um, with Italian, I speak Italian fluently, but it's not, it's super totally native, right? And I'd love to be able to get there. And I thought, wait a minute, Italians dub everything. And as Americans, we usually think of, oh, dubbing, that's so like low class. But it's actually very common for especially a lot of Southern European countries to do that with all their material. So I remember back in 2005, the voice actor who did Tom Cruise, I was in Italy at the time, he passed away. And then he had a different voice, and they said, that's not Tom Cruise. Um, and it's that kind of thing. But it's really how they interact with the characters. So I started watching a lot of stuff, starting with good old Star Trek: The Next Generation, and it's amazing. I can get to listen to this language that I know really well, and I'm constantly picking up vocabulary. And I've always liked Star Trek since I was a kid, so I know the episodes like the back of my hand. So there's no way I can not understand something. So I'm going to start with that, and then watch more and more either dub stuff or content that's in Italian, in a language I know. So I'd say for all those of you out there who have a language that you already know well, find a way to get a hold of the dubbed stuff, which exists for a lot of these languages, because it can be at first it's weird, especially like as Americans, we're like, I'm not gonna watch dub. Just look in their eyes, don't watch their mouths,
Right.
and you'll be fine. Because I was so against it for years, I'm like, this is one of the best resources I could have used, and that's my new thing now. But that's for a language I know well. But you asked like, how do you get started with a new language? Japanese was tough because back in 2000, when did I go there? 2012 when I got there. There's very little available, but I ended up finding a combination of a really streamlined grammar guide, a way to learn the Chinese characters, the kanji, relatively efficiently, and I had access to as many Japanese people as I could meet in Tokyo. Um,
Sure.
so I was able to immerse myself as much as I wanted. Or I could have stayed on base and never interacted with people in Japanese, like a lot of other Americans on base probably would, and in fact they did, which is why I started to try to teach it there. I'd say that's probably a characteristic too of my journey, is I've always found myself wanting to try to teach the languages too, because I've found some
Mhm.
novel method or something in particular that was really effective for me, and I thought, well, I could teach a class based on that. So I taught my classes there, Japanese to American military personnel for 3 years, which is great. It's interesting because there's so many obstacles to language learning. I think a big one is confidence and in oneself. People think, oh, I'm just not good at languages. Like people say, oh, I'm not good at math or whatever. I think a lot of that is a self-limiting belief to give ourselves the excuse of I'm not capable of doing this thing, and therefore I have the excuse not to be good at it or not to try. I think all human beings are like that in one thing or another. In language learning, it comes up like anything else. So the materials, if you have materials, I found good enough materials for these various languages. If it's a living language, you have a lot easier time because there's so much out there. Um, I'm very much into auditory inputs, so I create a lot of audio input with my audiobooks and YouTube videos to try to hear as much of it as possible, and really, use all those four learning methods at the same time to get, if you can have a kinesthetic experience. Excuse me. None of the labels are available in my office here at the moment, but I have stuff labeled in ancient Greek at the moment. But there was a time it was all in Japanese years ago. So that was really trying to immerse yourself as much as you can on multiple levels, make it so you get to the point where you sit down. I have my little stool here. You sit around and you can look around your office, wherever you are, and you can see. So use Latin. So like there's a window. So that's fenestra, and I can say per fenestram rivulum video. I see a stream through the window, and that kind of thing. Were you able to describe the world around you? And you can start with that, I think, day one. If you know enough words to
Hmm.
construct a basic sentence. Courses like the Asimil courses could be helpful, the way to get you into that. When it comes to an ancient language, though, or an old one like Old Norse, the Latin exists. That's the Lingua Latina series. I'm working on ancient Greek materials now for Scorpio Martianus to try to give that full immersion. Um, it's so materials based. So I think you need to have the materials of the right teacher, the time, and the desire. If you don't have those three things, it's not going
Right.
to happen.
Right. Well, and the desire for the process, not just the end point of being able to impress the ladies with your ancient Greek reading. Which I think actually those are two different things. Um, and there's a lot there. I'm going to dam up the Patreon questions for a minute because there's a lot there that I agree with really strongly. For one thing, I mean, you mentioned having the bug to teach it when you're learning it. I'm the exact same way, and I learn better when I can teach, right? There's nothing I know better than the stuff I have taught for years because I've had to put it in words that make it understandable to someone who's not stepped up on the step stool yet. Another thing that strikes me is, you mentioned describing things around you. I do that too, um, but I always felt a little bit artificial, like sitting in a room and saying, I see a stream through the window because I don't think about that stuff in English. So I would make myself do this in times when I would have an internal monologue about something. And for me, that's what I'm driving because I'm always judging all the other drivers, right? So if I'm learning a language, I'm judging them in that language,
I
right?
love that.
I'm sitting there formulating, yeah, but it's not because like there's already an internal monologue going on. So I just say, well, let me make this useful,
Right.
right?
That's brilliant.
So
I
it's
agree. Make your internal monologue, that thing that we can't shut off unless we meditate anyway, into a language learning opportunity.
right, and then with the modern Scandinavian languages, one thing that I do if I'm about to be, in another country or I'm about to have a phone conversation or something in one of these languages, and I just want to kind of get those wheels turning again. Um, I'm not a Jehovah's Witness, but the Jehovah's Witness website has the Bible in just about any language you could ask for, and it's all read by native speakers. You can sit there and just listen
Wow.
and read, and it's a very quick, um, if you know the Bible well, it's a very quick, nice way of kind of getting back into the stream of a language.
Uh,
So
mm.
just little things that I think reinforce some of the points you made.
I advocate that too. Yeah, I did a live stream on Easter and Christmas where I did some of the text relevant to both those events. And of course, I started because there's plenty of people in classics and interested in languages who have no interest in religion. Maybe even they've been turned off by it,
Hmm.
and which is fair. And so they don't want to look in the Bible. But I'd say, hey, this is written word for word. This is sentence for sentence in good idiom for speakers, either of the modern languages or ancient ones, especially the Latin and the Greek. Um, so let's take advantage of it, whether we have an interest in the material itself or not, because it's relatively easy to read, and so why not use it for language learning?
Right. There is no more. There's no text you're going to find more apparatus for. Um, let's take a patron question here. John Phillips asked something interesting. Could you spend some time comparing the Vikings' fighter but not military culture versus maybe the martial culture of the Roman Empire, and any parallels you, Luke, might see in the modern military?
Ooh,
I'll hand that to you.
that's interesting. Yeah, well, I certainly am not the expert on the Norse side for the sake of comparison, but the Roman side, yeah. I mean, so much of what we think of as just normal in the way things are in government, law, military structures really often trace their origins back to especially the Code of Justinian, and then from the Eastern Roman Empire stuff, which of course came from the older Western or the original, the OG Roman Empire stuff. And
Right.
and yeah, so the way that the similarities are pretty clear, especially if you look at older militaries, like say the U.S. military circa the Civil War, when you still had basic infantry that are doing a lot of the work in cavalry. Because after that, in the modern times, so much is technology based that it's yeah, we absolutely have infantry and they're vital in the military extraordinarily. But so much is dependent on aircraft, which is the new cavalry, or the tanks, which are also kind of cavalry, right? That mounted
Mm.
kind of fighter. Um, and whereas the Romans used very little of that, they just never got into the horses. I don't know why. Um, they always had said, "Oh, you foreign auxiliaries, you do the horses." I don't know why, in particular.
Yeah.
But the biggest weird thing would probably be that you had the connection between the military and civil life was completely the same. Senators would go and lead legions, or be commanders, like Cicero's brother, who worked for Caesar as one of his generals. The kind of weird stuff. And so you had to do anything. Like Cicero had a military experience. If you want to make it in government, you have to be in the military. If you want to make it in military, you also have to have that. So it's a little bit more like the book Starship Troopers in a way, which to be a to yeah, I've no comment or opinion on the book itself, except that I read it and I know that the idea is to in that future society, which I don't know, utopian, dystopian, whatever you want to call it. The idea is this confluence of like to be a citizen, you have to have this military service, and I think that's really different from our voluntary military service like we have in this country, and where civilian government is put above military authorities.
That's well observed, and I think you're right that that is something that has changed in English-speaking culture. That you would find something much closer to the Roman model, um, maybe in the maybe in parts of the United States and parts of the 19th century. I mean, that really depends too. There's also a deep, long-standing American distrust of the military that's embedded in a lot of our civil institutions, which I think is totally foreign to the Roman world.
Yeah.
But I think,
Mm.
and then I think a lot of these categories are really foreign to the Norse world, where like you can translate the word soldier. Um, Back when I would do lots of translation requests, people always wanted that, but it seems really artificial because a soldier is just a man usually, right? He's someone who's raiding for the summer. He's going to go back to his farm in the winter. Someone that the king, pressed into some defensive force or invading force at some point. Like there's no one who goes through life as a professional soldier. Just about. Although maybe the king's bodyguards are kind of an exception to that. Um, and I think that's really alien to our 21st century, at least American norms, where soldier is not just an occupation, but forever after you have been in the military. It's a major social marker, right? I mean, I have a lot of friends who are veterans, and it's one of the first things you know about them, right? They've
Yeah.
got the stickers on their cars, or one of the first things that comes up when they're telling stories is some story from their military service. It's a big um, subculture that's, and I guess that may be familiar to the Roman model, but then it's not so much a subculture because everybody's kind of that subculture.
It is interesting too,
I don't know.
and I think there's shorthand in social interactions when we meet people. For
Hmm.
example, um, I'm not a doctorate of languages. My degrees are in geology. And I'm extremely proud of the work that I've gotten to do in geology, but frankly, that's part of my past. And I do other
Hmm.
things now. And whereas you're the real deal. You actually a doctorate in the language, and you of course have the other characteristics that have allowed you to create all this great content on YouTube, which is great. You're a great communicator naturally. So these things go together, right? But that said, you and I can relate because, hey, we've done the work to study these languages. We know what the dative case is, that kind of thing. What that means immediately is you and I can relate on a level where we know each other in that respect. And when it comes to, or for example, I'm not from the West, but I spent a lot of time out there, and I love it to death. So the fact that we could talk about the Rocky Mountains, or we talk about Wyoming, or any aspect of that, immediately you and I, it creates the shorthand of like, oh yeah, you like this other thing that I like, and so there's a similarity. With military too, I find that people, not just from different branches. I've been both Air Force and Army National Guard, but Marines, sailors, Coast Guard, as well as people from militaries of our allied countries I've gotten to work with. There's immediately the sense of fraternity of like, you've gone through the same stuff that I've had to go through, and therefore there's that kind of essence of a bond. And I think that's why it shows up so distinctly when you meet them.
Right. Yeah, I think suffering is a major uniter of people. Um, that seems pretty universal. Uh, could I ask? I don't know if in the Air Force you have do you say MOS in the Air Force? Do you have an what is do you have an
AFSC
MOS?
is the Air Force term, and MOS is the Army term. And I'm Army
Okay.
National Guard now, so I speak Army at this current time.
Okay.
Yeah, the Air
That's
Force
also what my
specialty code, because of course you have to. The Air Force has a different everything, and it's always a little bit nerdier. And the Air Force specialty code AFSC is the MOS equivalent. Yeah,
okay. All right. What was yours?
I was a logistics officer. I didn't want to do that though. I wanted to fly, so that's why. But once you get stuck in a career field, it can be very difficult to get out of it. But I managed to do so only by leaving the Air Force to go fly in the Army, and that is weird. But I got it. It works. It's amazing the strange rivulets that you get pushed down as you fall through the canyon of life.
Well, that's the real world. It's completely unpredictable and weird. And I'll say one more thing. You mentioned about how the fact that we both know what a dative is or something is something that we can immediately have a conversation about. We know something about each other with, and I think that you know to me, you were saying I'm like the real deal. So like, I don't really care so much about this real deal stuff anymore. I find that however you learn something, you know it. And I know a lot of people that have been through degree programs in X, Y, or Z who don't know it as well as someone who's truly passionate about it, who's really gone and made the effort to learn it and understand it. And I think it's a big deal that we so often ignore. And I think that it's something that you are doing a great job of, you're not, it never feels like you're handing down the tablets of Latin from the mountain, like you're you're a guide who's walked the trail and is now happy to show someone else the trail.
Yeah,
But
and that's what we want to do as
that's
teachers, right? We want to
right.
give people the opportunity, whatever they want, if they're an enthusiast or they're intending to be a professional, whether teacher, translator, a scholar, really. And that's what's so great. And I love either directly hearing the message from you in your videos, especially the past year or so, or indirectly through the fact that, hey, I make this content for free because look at this wonderful technological tool that we have now. Anybody can learn anything if they have the patience and if they have the interest. And here, have provide the material, which is what we're basically doing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Adding, it's like just add interest and will. See, I'm gonna check what is down in the ask a question section, and I don't know what's earlier and what's not. So I'll look at the bottom one. Daniel asks, I'm currently studying linguistics, and over the past year, I've gained a huge interest in cuneiform and Assyriology. Can you give me some advice on how to start learning an ancient language like that so I can study it in depth and perhaps go into that field? I feel like Akkadian is very different from ancient languages like Old Norse since it's Semitic and there's thousands of different symbols and characters to learn. I think we actually kind of covered this
In a
maybe
way.
after this
Yeah.
had been asked because I don't know when it was asked.
Well, what do you do about
Do you
materials
have
for
any
that?
thoughts?
Yeah.
Well, so this is another case where you have a writing system that's very difficult to learn. You have any comments about that?
I
Maybe
love writing
you
systems.
they are great.
Yeah, they are fun. Though it's of course convenient that when they're written with some kind of transcription. Yeah, cuneiform is so cool. I know barely anything about it. I've done a little bit of stuff with Egyptian, ancient Egyptian, Middle Egyptian specifically, but very, very little. I'd say one of the biggest things for me, because I'm so into audio input, I can create my own. If I know the phonology, I can reconstruct it. I could do something. Because I'd love to study those languages, I think it was Daniel who asked that, right? Like Daniel wants to do, um, and I maybe someday. I certainly would if I could find it. But what would I do? Um, I'd s- I start with a Google search, right away, maybe even Google Scholar, start to get an idea of what it's like. I'd be very interested in the phonology and the writing system, see how easily I might be able to get a grasp of it and start to because when we have our own Roman alphabet and we've all heard Spanish, it's easy enough to figure out that all right, Latin's kind of in that same thing, but I don't really know what to
Hmm.
expect. Thankfully, I have this weird thing way out in East Field, shall I say, the left field instead the from Japanese. So I have this kind of like, oh, I can see how different a language can be from the far east of Asia. So that's gives me some I guess perspective since mostly I just know Indo-European languages. And I've studied a bit of Arabic, so if you are looking at a language, Daniel, that's related to Semitic languages, it might be valuable to learn either modern or ancient Hebrew, which are more accessible relatively, or modern standard Arabic, and then get into classical Arabic just a little bit to get it, because there's, depending on if it's a Semitic
Hmm.
language, there'll be all those really cool pharyngeal sounds like ayin. I love ayin, so cool.
Uh,
And yeah.
that's a good thought. Is approaching what you can find that's familiar in a modern language today. Um, as an aside about that, my grandmother, this kind of ties back to something we were talking about earlier. My grandmother Crawford was a ancient Near East scholar, although completely by avocation. She just got a master's degree in her spare time while raising her kids, and so she gave me all of her old notebooks on Akkadian and Egyptian, and I just have these bags stuffed with her notes. Where she was working through these German language textbooks that she had Xeroxed in the 1970s.
Mm,
Um, it's tough.
wow.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, not an easy field. Well,
That's
hopefully that
amazing.
was some. Yeah, isn't that weird that we both kind of wound up doing something uh, slightly adjacent?
Mm.
Um, let's see. Andrew Rabbit was asking. I know that the Varangian Guard were in Constantinople. Are there any references to Old Norse in Greek texts, or vice versa?
Old Norse and Greek texts. I'm sure there are because if they're in Constantinople, their very presence, the language there is Greek. It would be medieval Greek, but it's all Greek. That's actually fun.
Yeah,
When does ancient Greek become medieval Greek, become modern Greek? That's a 600-page book I can recommend. Um,
yeah, right. I mean,
but
because
yeah,
I
I'm
would
sure
say
so.
it's basically it's more like medieval Greek already by like 300. Um, I do know of some mention of Old Norse in one Greek text. I can't remember what it's called, but it's an account from the Byzantine period about how the Varangians travel from the north to Constantinople.
Ooh, cool.
And so it's like the directions down the rivers. And so there's a few Old Norse names for things. Like this is the waterfall they call Don't Sleep. And you can tell that it's uh, a Greek rough transcription of someone saying in Old Norse, "Sovivegi," don't sleep.
Mm.
Um, so that's there. So there's a little bit like that. Um,
I guess they just inverted
as to
Norse by Southwest, right?
right, it's I guess yeah, southwest by Norse or or southeast by Norse. Um, and then like in Old Norse mentions of Greek. I mean, of course, in learned literature
Wow,
from
really?
after the conversion, you're going to find Greek terms, for astronomy and things like that. And but in Viking Age texts or stuff about the Viking Age, you're really just going to find names of like emperors and stuff like that. It's
Mm.
not much. Um, and of course, they even use their own name for Constantinople, Miklagard, the big enclosure.
Well, that's a
Um,
great name.
yeah, it's
And Mick and Mickle, like
I mean,
Scots language, muckle.
yep, yep.
Yeah. I
I mean, it
remember
must
Mormon
have seemed
Muckle, I
huge.
connected to Old Norse. Go ahead, sorry.
Yep.
Mhm.
No, I just mean it must have seemed incredibly huge. I mean, in the Viking Age, there was no settlement larger than a trading outpost of a few hundred people. So Constantinople must have been overwhelming.
Mm.
Hence the name. Let's see. Marcel has something down in the Ask Questions section. I'm not sure this is the right place to ask. Feel free to ignore me. The Catholic Church is known for carefully documenting the lives of heretics. Records, the Inquisition Register of Montelieu is a famous source of medieval life. Is there any chance there's a secret library in an abandoned prison cell in the Vatican cellars that holds information on, for instance, Germanic pagan practices or something else relevant to the Pacific Viking Age? I have no idea.
Anything's
Any thoughts?
possible. Actually, as far as hidden
Yeah.
stuff, I know I have a friend who is Pompeian, and she's a fascinating person. She's a ancient musical instrument archaeologist, and she reconstructs them and performs with them with a group, which is impressive.
That's cool.
Very cool person, incredibly knowledgeable, and she was just telling me a few weeks ago how in Herculaneum, which is because they're two basically mostly preserved cities of the Vesuvian eruption of 79 AD, are of course Pompeii, which is more famous, but Herculaneum, which is way harder to get to, but so much better because you got like 2 stories that are preserved. You get like the roofs and everything, and these amazing like I've taken a lot of the stuff from Pompeii and put it in the Naples Museum, but most of the stuff in Herculaneum is still there. You can still enjoy it in
Cool.
situ. And it's so cool, and you can walk the streets, but they've only, thankfully, perhaps, excavated 1/4 of it because a lot was been destroyed in Pompeii through excavations, through poor 19th century archaeology practices. So they're slowly working through, and I am just so hoping that Julius Caesar's book on Latin grammar that has been lost to time, among many other things. I really want that one because he explains a phonology thing that there's always a debate about. The difference between maximus and maximus, and when the vowel changed, the sonus medius, if you remember hearing about that. Um,
That's
it's real.
is
It's obscure
is
to
he
everyone
supposed to
except me.
handle that?
Yes, because he's the reason that, like, we say a maxim or maximal or whatever we say in English with the letter I and every other language because he instituted that spelling change, and it was an oo before because it was switching from oo to e. It was fronting, and
Hmm.
he describes in more detail apparently why he made that choice, and then he instituted it during his tyranny.
I'll be
Yeah,
Well, that would be very cool. And hey, I mean, maybe somewhere in there's some ethnological notes on other peoples of the ancient world. I mean, I know that they've developed a lot of new techniques for reading old scrolls with, I think, lasers.
that's
Now
right.
they can actually look at the different layers even without unrolling the scroll. So
Yeah.
yeah, that would be a cool place to find something like that. There's some potential there. Um, Marcel also asked over here if you know Chinese Pod. He says he used to learn Mandarin about 10 years ago when it was still free.
Hmm. Yeah, there's a lot
Is that
of them. I
familiar?
haven't looked at them in years, but there's like an Italian pod, a Spanish pod, Chinese pod. I think there's a lot of them. They were all under that. They have a YouTube accounts for all these different things. I don't know the individuals who run them, but my response generally would be that whatever works, because that's another thing with materials. Like I'm not a big fan of Duolingo in particular, but a lot of people really are. I'd say, great. I have a different path that I recommend, which is those books I was mentioning earlier for Latin, for example. But if it's working for you right now and you find some reward in it, that's great. So whatever, and the language pod ones, I think there's a lot of good material on there. I've seen some like for modern Greek, where they have like situational things, and they have like the different what's that scheme called? The European like A1, A2. Excuse me. Excuse me.
Oh, yeah, right.
Um,
The competency and
yeah.
difficulty levels.
And they have them all measured out on that on most of those language pod YouTube channels. And yeah, it's great. It's auditory input. You get the written input. It's the best stuff for non-active, non-producing, non-productive language use. I think it's great. Yeah.
And I also mentioned to you earlier the really impressive uh, and surprisingly slim book, Classical Chinese for Everyone by Brian Van Norden, which really impressed me. It's from my publisher, Hackett, uh,
Mm.
with how in very few pages it actually gets you kind of competently halfway reading Chinese. So there's amazing resources out there.
Mm.
Vicky asked, going back to the Bible reference, how different is Koine Greek from modern Greek?
Oh, I love this question because it usually ends in fights. No, I'm just kidding. Um, so, so much of this, and I find this all really enjoyable, these debates, especially with Greek more lately, but there's always the thing. So here's the main problem is that modern Greek and ancient Greek have the same name, which is Greek, and modern Italian and the other Romance languages don't have the same name as Latin. And therefore, that
True.
alone, normally you think a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, and it does, unless it's called a stink blossom, I suppose. Because what that does is since there is that inherent labeled disconnect between the Romance languages and Latin, we don't expect them to be the same. Now,
Right.
add to that that modern Greeks have even stronger than say Italians, I think, a very strong patriotic defense of their ancient culture that they're extremely proud of, and I think that's great and wonderful. And what's interesting is how it turns up in their scientific papers, where I can cite it. I can't think of his name on the moment, but I could look it up if someone's really interested. A paper written not too long ago by a legitimate philologist who was demonstrating, look, modern Greek pronunciation is identical to 5th century BC Attic. Of course, Koine is in between. So I bring that up as an example that the idea that the language has, like, because you'll find Greeks who insist that the ancient Greek language is the same language as theirs. Whereas any native English speaker is not going to say that Beowulf is the same language as theirs, especially because they don't know it,
Mm.
because they're not exposed to it. And they say,
Right.
I can't read this. Garden of something. I don't know. They don't. We don't.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I barely know anything about Old English. Anyway, except to know that this is not the same language, but it's I can see how stan becomes stone. Stanum, the stone. That's really
Sure.
and the connection to Old Norse are apparent. But even though there are very similar differences, especially huge changes in phonology between the ancient and Koine, of course, is part of that ancient Greek. Koine, to give a time period, we say arbitrary, because these are just arbitrary things we come up with, right? We say it starts with Alexander the Great's conquest in the middle of the 4th century BC, going to the end of antiquity. Where does antiquity end? Great question. Well, kind of where you want it to. You could say, oh, when the Western Roman Empire falls, or after Justinian's reign, and it's always slowly kind of evolving. And then there's this interesting tendency of both Greek and Latin to really revere the older versions of the language. Like Latin especially got fixed in first century through second century BC through first century AD written texts.
Mm.
And so that's when we learn to speak Latin today, and that's the language we teach. And we don't say that the informal, vulgar Latin, which is something that'd be interesting to talk about, or the Vulgate Bible, which is not written in the same language that we teach, though it's relatively similar. Medieval Latin, we don't look down. Well, I try to discourage people from looking down on them, but it's just not the same thing. And Greek very much constantly and weirdly goes through these periods, even up until the 20th century, of really revering the ancient language so much. Have you heard of Katharevusa?
Yeah, that's versus Demotica or something, right?
That's right.
That's the
Yeah.
purified language that's closer to ancient. Yeah.
Right. They purified it from the medieval Greek, which was already basically ancient Greek for the most part. So it was so
Yeah.
interesting is like there was, for a lot of Greek speakers, the genitive plural was gone. They restored it in the 19th century. According to the book Horrocks, which I've read, which I barely know. I know a little bit of modern Greek. I know a little bit more of ancient Greek, shall I say? But there's so much to learn and know that I feel like relatively out of my depth with that
Mm.
wonderful and vast ocean of language and material and literature. Basically, a huge amount of this is a combination of throughout the centuries, the millennia, Greek speakers and writers are constantly archaizing up until the modern day. Well, even the dative case doesn't exist as modern Greek, but they have idioms that they frequently use, which still contain the dative case. They're just got these fixed things,
Mm.
and they also still, to my knowledge, all their church services they only use the Koine Bible, which is first, second century A.D. ancient Greek. And because they're so familiar with them and they know what it means, they think that they says it is familiar enough and similar enough, at least especially when they use a modern pronunciation, which of course they would only use that, that they tend to think that, oh yeah, well, this ancient Greek language, Koine, is basically the same thing as modern Greek. But if you look
Mm.
at it from a linguistic perspective, you can see that there's no infinitives in modern Greek. Ancient Greek has like
Right,
8 inventions,
right,
so they're totally
right.
different. But
That's part of that whole aerial southeastern Europe set of features that like are weirdly shared by like
oh
Romanian
yeah,
and
the
Bulgarian and Greek. Yeah,
Balkansprachbund. I love the
yeah.
Balkansprachbund. It's so cool. Yeah. So
No,
is
that's
how similar is Koine
well
to Modern
observed.
Greek? Koine is more similar to other forms of Koine is just ancient Greek, a variety of ancient Greek, no more different than Stephen King and Jane Austen are from each other as writers, I would say.
Well, and it's also very well observed about the difference between, when we put a different label on something, we expect it to be more different than when it has the same label. And you can have these little label wars, right? I mean, there's all kinds of fighting about, what do you call, do you say Serbo-Croatian? Do you say Serbian? Do you say Croatian? Right? All these
BCSM
labels have such,
or BSCM, that's what it is. I never remember.
yeah,
Depends in which letter you put
right.
first as a political
Bosnian,
question.
yes, right, Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, that's right. Yeah, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Let's see. Griffin asks, can you speak about the influence that Erasmus of Rotterdam has had on our understanding and use of Latin and Greek today, like in spelling conventions and pronunciation, etc.?
And if I caught that, Jackson, the question was on Erasmus's pronunciation
Yeah,
restoration. Yeah. So
yeah.
Erasmus, and when did he write his book, De Recta Pronunciatione Sermonis Latini et Graeci? I think that's the right name of the book, but which means about the pronunciation of the correct pronunciation of Latin and ancient Greek. And he has a bear and a lion chat about the topic because that makes sense, and it's really lovely. And it's basically he effectively, which I think is impressive for his century, is able to philologically, through just reading the text and grammarians, understand the pronunciations of Latin. I think ancient Latin, the basics, pretty well. And Greek also reasonably well. The only thing that he got wrongish was the pronunciation of epsilon iota as an a diphthong, which he assumed just from analogy with Latin. Epsilon iota was actually the long vowel a in the classical ancient Greek, like 5th century BC, enclosed the e in most positions by the Hellenistic period, which is why what's a really good example is Alexandria. Oops, go ahead. You want to say something?
I was going to say that's why in Gothic, e epsilon iota actually spells the e sound
Ooh,
too, right?
cool. I know nothing about Gothic.
Yeah,
That's
because
really cool.
Gothic is like if you take really archaic Old Norse and spell it like medieval Greek.
That's a great idea.
Anyway, that's
I'm in love with that whole
yeah.
sentence.
It was someone's idea, but
I
I'm
love that.
sorry. Whoop, I
Whoops.
didn't mean to interrupt you or
Not
to
at
or to
all.
drop my laptop.
No, yeah, the Alexandria is a really cool example. I wrote it's on my website if people want to read my long essay where I talk about all these Greek things and all the politics and why I use the pronunciation system I do, which is a compromise on many levels. Because anyway, I think it's interesting. But I take these statistics about in Latin the word Alexandria, which of course is a Greek word, and how it's spelled. In Latin, it's written either Alexandria or Alexandrea, and it starts to change in spelling in the middle of the 1st century BC. And then less and less frequently you see Alexandria and more Alexandria. Now, in other positions, the epsilon iota was written, like say Poseidon, was just Poseidon with just a long e, just written as a letter I. Um, but before vowels, it started to shift. So even before vowels, it was preserved through the Hellenistic period as an e, like Alexandria, but close to Alexandria by that 1st century BC time. So that's the only thing I would criticize Erasmus himself for. The thing, though, is that the Erasmian pronunciation is usually a term used only for Greek and not really that much for Latin, because Latin we usually talk about the restored classical pronunciation as like the term for it, and it's constantly evolving. Like I've done some work with Dr. Andrea Calabrese, who realized some really important things about the pronunciation of classical Latin that go against the Sidney Allen, if you've heard of him, who was a great philologist from Cambridge from the middle of the 20th century. Oh, okay, that's sort of our classics world, and others too to look at like so we're like classical Latin pronunciation. If there's 2 or 3 centuries, and it's there's a lot of wiggle room in there, but it's not like this single target. Erasmian is different because it's sort of prescribed by Erasmus, and it hasn't been evolved deliberately forward by pretty much anyone in practical use for centuries. There's a lot more interest in the Western European countries in Latin than in Greek for obvious reasons. I think they're obvious, I guess. And then the other issue is that is that every single country actively ignores whatever rules of that pronunciation that go against their native phonology. Like Italians don't pronounce
Sure.
theta; they'll say theta. They won't make it any difference from the tau, which is fine. It's just a convention. But then you have these massive, like seen people try to speak in ancient Greek when they come from different countries, from Germany, Italy, Spain, France, US, and they can't understand each other, but they're all using Erasmian pronunciation. I think it's hilarious.
Huh. Huh. Well, I mean, and of course that's mirrored somewhat with something like Old Norse, where uh, some of the conventions for pronouncing it in Norway are different from the conventions in Iceland, and spelling it.
Oh, yeah.
People spell it in a way that looks a little bit more like Norwegian. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's familiar.
Cool.
I'm gonna scroll down here to another question. John Phillips asked, "Would Luke have any thoughts toward which regional variant of the Greek alphabet could have made its way north and become the runes?"
Ah, yeah, you did a video about this recently, didn't you?
I've
Yeah,
done. Yeah,
go ahead.
it's a hobby horse of mine.
Mm. Oh, it's so interesting. There's yeah, I think you even talked about a theory that John McWhorter used to kind of say, yeah, it's possible. And now he's like, I definitely believe, or that he's not quite that far, but he's pretty strong, I think, on the argument of Phoenicians having influenced Germanic at some point and helping to cause the what was it called, the Grimm's Law, right, from Patafa and all those things.
I did not know that was him. I knew that was something that was gaining traction. I didn't realize it was that he was
I
promoting
don't
it.
think
Oh, that's
he's
interesting.
founding it, but he talked about it in the first time I heard about it was in Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue, the book he wrote years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and where he mentioned it, like this little like epilogue at the end, and like, oh, by the way, and it's like what? And now, but
Huh.
I listened to his podcast some point last year, and he was saying like, yeah, he was just saying like almost as if he was quite convinced by the evidence at this point. But that's another thing entirely.
Huh. Okay.
Uh, but the influence, yeah, because it's so interesting. We think of Greek alphabet, Latin alphabet, but then there's the Etruscan alphabet, and then because people say, oh, Latin alphabet comes from the Greek alphabet, but it's like, well, mostly it comes from Etruscan, with further influence from Western Greek alphabets, which were quite different, or at least various. And I guess the question, is it possible that the runes came from some variety of a Western Greek alphabet? Or mixed with Etruscan or whatever they could get their hands on.
I think it's possible. I also think it's possible it was even from the Eastern Greek alphabet. I mean, there's such an incredible diversity of Greek scripts before it gets standardized. I mean, even Athens used its own version of the Greek script before they standardized on the Ionic script around 400 BC. I don't think we have ever seen, and I don't think we will ever see all of the varieties of the Greek alphabet. But I do think that there are enough features of the runes that look Greek but not Roman that it has to be from some version of the Greek alphabet, maybe adapted to write some intermediary language. And people always try to argue against this and say, well, but the F looks like the Roman F. Well, there's digamma in a lot of these old Greek alphabets too. The R looks like a Roman R. That's also something you find in some Greek alphabets. But you don't find omega in Italy. And the O in runes looks like omega, and it comes at the end of the alphabet. So I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a hobby horse of mine.
Even
but
in
I have no idea.
Just in the first book, I'm pretty sure I'm remembering this right, but I think it's the first book of the Gallic Wars. It's the war with the Helvetii, or the Helvetians, the Swiss. And
Yeah.
I love how the modern technical name for Switzerland is the Confederation of the Helvetians. And it's on their, it's like was it CFH or something, or CH? They have it everywhere on their
Well,
money and
that's what
everything.
that's for.
Yeah,
I
it's
knew
Latin.
CH was their little emblem. Oh, that's cool. I didn't know
Yeah.
that was for the Confederacy of the Helvetians. That's
Yeah,
rad.
and we modern speakers of Latin, we call like I have a friend whose name is Beatus Helvetius. He's a Swiss German native speaker, but his name is Beat, which is right from the Latin, and called himself the Happy Helvetian, Beatus Helvetius. It's fantastic, wonderful
That's
fellow.
really
Anyway,
cool.
yeah, and so the battle with them, the war with them that Caesar waged, I'm pretty sure that's where, or was a different part of the Gallic Wars, if I'm mistaken, where they were trying to transmit messages between tribes, between each other in the Greek alphabet, just because they thought the Romans wouldn't understand it or something, and I think Caesar's and with a very kind of concealed kind of snarkiness is like, well, yeah, of course we understood them, and then we figured it out, that kind of thing. So that kind of proliferation of the Greek
Huh,
alphabets was going on first century BC already.
sure. Well, I mean, you see the Greek alphabet show up in Marseille long before the Romans were there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but who knows exactly which version? I doubt we'll ever find all of them. Um, anyway, another question here. Matt asks, "What is your favorite part of learning these languages? The journey, the ability to read the stories and the history?" I ask as I'm slowly working through uh, Saga of Ega One Hand.
Ooh, that's a really interesting question. I am highly motivated by the speaking of the language with other people, which is strange for an ancient language. And I don't know where I got the idea. It just seemed like natural to me that, oh, I'll speak Latin with people. And now some of the closest friendships I have are with people with whom I have either only ever spoken in Latin or nearly exclusively. Some really close working
Hmm,
relationships and friendships with just these great people, as well as, acquaintances I know from all around the world, and we've only used Latin. And I find that really stimulating, but also I guess I'm kind of an extroverted person, so I like to talk with people in general. But that's not everybody's motivation for sure. They might just want to enjoy the literature on their own. And I think being able to have the one-on-one conversation with an ancient author, it's one way, but Erasmus said too that a lot of his closest acquaintances were people that he's had conversations with that were one way from the past to him. And he felt, since he, of course, spoke the language very fluently and wrote the language very fluently, that they were able to speak to him directly about their experiences, their lives, their poetry, whatever it was. I find that immensely rewarding. So on the less extroverted, the more introverted side of ourselves, of being able to just enjoy that special, unique experience with an ancient author, my favorite part is the poetry. Um, I'm really moved by that. Ideas like I really like the poem by Ovid where he says that It starts non ego nobilium sed eo studiosus secorum cui tamen ipsa foes vincat utile precor, where he's sitting in the Circus Maximus with his girlfriend, and she's super into the horse races, and he's saying in the poem, "I'm not here because I'm interested in this at all. I don't even care about sports. I'm a poet, but um, you are." And I hope whoever wins. I hope that charioteer wins. And then he goes on to say that I'm here so that I'm here to talk with you and spend time with you, and so that you know that I care about you. And it's this wonderful romantic idea, because any of us who have had like almost all of us have maybe had the opportunity, if not even in a romantic relationship, but just to have done something with a loved one for the sake of being with that loved one.
sure.
And that just resonates through time. And that was 2,500, 2,050 years ago when that was written. But it's exactly the same as us. And I like how it reminds us that whatever we might go through, for thousands of years, people have gone through some really similar stuff. As much as our own experience has a lot of weight, and it's like, this is something that I'm going through, if it's bad, or oh, this is something that's really special for me. Well, really, we're part of this great and amazing chain. And by learning an ancient language, I think in particular, we get like latched into it, like, whoa, holy cow, I'm on this river that connects from thousands of years ago and is going to go. I think we'll be fine. I'm an optimist. We're gonna be fine. We'll colonize Mars. We're not gonna blow the humanity up. We're gonna be fine, and we're just gonna keep moving this on to the future. And simply by learning the language, of being a part of this transmission of an ancient or old language, we're creating these chains and these links between um, centuries and otherwise disparate people who ultimately will realize that, yeah, we're all human.
I don't think I could say any of that any better, but that's that was perfect. And actually, it ties into something asked here by Stitch, who says, "What do the both of you tell people who say dead languages are useless to learn?"
You, sir.
Well, you're on a roll.
Oh, am I? Oh, okay. No, well, they're not. Useless for what? Utility? If you want to do business in China, Japan, Germany, wherever you like, Russia, learn those languages to do the job. But why does someone learn the piano? If they would become a professional concert pianist and they end up making that their living, their money, well, that's great. But obviously, someone who does something with that kind of skill and artfulness is probably getting something out of it more than just wage, right? Um, but for the most part, people who learn something like learning something that stimulates a different side of them as a hobby, which it could be any kind of hobby, but especially if it's an art, whether a musical art, a fine art, there's no utility in that. I mean, Winston Churchill was painting up until his final years. He did some really nice paintings too. Why did he do that? Like, there was no utility in that for him at all, especially after he was retired and he wasn't prime minister anymore for the second time. Well, so, but why was that valuable to him? Well, it's interesting too. And my father's an artist, and I deeply love fine art as well, ancient or to the modern era, everything in between. But languages for me in any way, it speaks to me more because I get to have this conversation with Ovid or Catullus, and they get to tell me some really interesting things, just the way that art can speak in a more abstract way.
We
Oh,
we were we were just answering about dead languages being useless. What we say in response to that.
learning the violin's pretty useless unless you're making money off of it. But there's
Yeah, and
some
I
other
think that's
value.
exactly right. And I think that's exactly the crux of this. I mean, it probably depends on my mood. If I'm real depressed and someone says everything you know is useless, I'll say yeah. But in other moods, I will say, well, you probably spend a lot of time watching your favorite sports team. You might spend a lot of time reading your favorite author. Is that making you money? In fact, you're probably losing money on those things. Um, these things are only useless in the sense if you are expecting them to be a career path, and we have so sort of careerized any decision to spend a lot of time on something that we have this anxiety about putting a lot of time, effortful time into something that we're not going to make money off of. But in fact, I think that some of the most rewarding things we can do are things that we put effort into that we don't depend on to put dinner on the table. Because having it put dinner on the table can kind of ruin something after a while. Um,
Mm.
so I would just say, it's useless only in the sense that you're expecting to make a career out of it and don't know how to. Um, but that doesn't have to be what it's about. And I think that colleges do a bad job of uh, teaching people that, by the way,
Yeah.
right? Because it's always, what are you going to major in and then what are you going to do with it? Well, those can be separate questions.
Mm.
Uh, I'm going to go, I'm looking at the comments on the old one, looking for questions that we missed there. Andrich asked, Luke, can you comment on your experience with the eco-linguist channel's mutual intelligibility videos? I enjoy the Latin to other Romance language videos that he led.
That was a great opportunity. Yeah. And Norbert's the best too. What a amazing fellow who came up with the
He's a
idea.
fun guy.
Yeah, he's great. Um, it's amazing because I suppose because I've used for a long time, having studied other, frankly, much better teachers of Latin than me, how to really make stuff communicative and understandable. For example, this is of course the worst teacher thing. I just pick up a thing that's randomly around me, and then say this is the thing. Oh, in fact, actually, someone wanted to see the book, so I'll use this as my prop. So, for example, exempli gratia, Jacksoni, ecce hic liber habet titulum familia Romana, est titulus huius libri, et ego teneo librum meis manibus, manus meis manibus teneo hunc librum, et hic habeo perspicilla ocularia mea, ubi sunt in mea manu, et iam sunt in mea facie. And just doing stuff like that, where I'm confident enough that people with either they know a Romance language, or, for example, I know you've obviously studied Latin, so that wasn't the weirdest thing. It wasn't, I don't know, Vedic Sanskrit. So there, you had some level of familiarity. So I was highly confident that whatever I would do and show and demonstrate, even if you weren't getting single words, you probably understand everything that was going on. So I was pretty
Right.
confident I could make that happen with those people, and they all could. And I thankfully know Italian and Spanish, but I didn't know Portuguese at the time. I've studied a little bit since then. So the wonderful fellow Gustavo from Brazil, he definitely confounded me with a few wonderful words that I love Portuguese now that I've gotten to study it a little bit more. But he would say things, I'd be like, and I was like, no, I wouldn't even say. But I understood the other two just fine.
That's fun. I did an ecolinguist video too. It's not up yet. Um,
It's great. I
but
didn't know that.
yeah, well, it was fairly recent, and he's editing it right now.
Are you
I don't
speaking
know exactly
Norse?
when it'll be up. Yeah, I speak Old Norse
This is
for
great.
yeah, for a Dane, a Norwegian, and an Icelander.
I'm
It's
thrilled.
a
I can't wait
somewhat
to see
different.
this.
It's it's a somewhat different game for the Icelander than for the other two. Um, but yeah, so I have also been on Norbert's channel. Just it's just not public, but it'll probably be public soon.
That's
Um,
great.
I also, while we're on the subject, I'll confess something in your presence, which is when I was in grad school, a bunch of us were, I guess, more than language nerds, and we had an RPG campaign, and we actually did all of the dialogue in medieval languages. So the narrative, the GM, all of that was in English, but we had to justify why the characters knew particular languages, and we had to communicate as characters with the other characters or the NPCs of those languages. So if you had so like two priests can talk to each other in Latin, but then two, you know, peasants from wherever probably can't understand each other. But then a Viking might have a smattering of Old English and be able to and be able to figure out the Old English someone else is speaking, but he has to actually speak Old English to him. So I've had a little bit of experience with that kind of living language stuff just for the heck of it back then.
That's
Confession
amazing.
over.
That's a confession. That's
Yeah,
like half the people I interact with on a daily basis do that now, and they're our age.
I haven't done this. I haven't done this in a long, long time. Um,
Yeah,
it was fun. I mean, it was it. We were just the right group to do it because we had such a broad mix of languages, and more or less everyone knew enough Latin to make that work as almost a lingua franca. But
nice.
we were able to justify. We had to actually justify in the character's backstory why they knew the languages we knew, which was kind of fun. I mean, mine was real easy, do a Norse character because Old Norse, Old English, and enough Latin. Like you can make a story for that, but we had to actually justify that from a medieval character's perspective.
That's
Anyway,
awesome.
so I've been there kind of, but I haven't done that in a
That's a
long, long,
proud
long
story,
time.
sir. That's
Maybe.
not a shame story.
Well, thank you, thank you. Maybe I need to try to do more of this. I can. I don't know. I have probably more mental blocks about it just because this sort of thing is so discouraged in at least in the, the programs I went through. Like,
What, discouraged to use the
it's
languages actively, or what?
yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
Yeah. So like a lot of the classrooms that I went through, you are not even supposed to make up examples, right? If you want an example sentence, it has to be traced to something, right? And not even just make up something simple like, I have a book, right? But that's a
Right.
whole other thing. Kind of connected to that, I see a question here, and I just lost it. Andrew asks, have either of you ever attempted to derive a conlang using Norse or a classical language as a parent language? So like a similar relationship to Latin, Latin to Italian, but with different sound changes.
Have you made a conlang, Dr. Crawford?
I, I've never made a conlang.
I remember being interested back when I was before I was starting to study Latin, and I was like, oh yeah, this I started like coming up with some stuff because I was learning about grammar like really well in depth to it, well, for a little bit. And what I discovered is that Latin itself, and then ancient Greek, I started studying that same year. I was like, wow, these are so interesting in and of themselves. And oh yeah, look at Hindi. Hindi's amazing, and Sanskrit, and all these other things, and Chinese. And then I fell out of love with that creative process because I felt there was so much for me to learn from living in ancient languages that are well attested, just to understand how languages work. So I ended up saying, well, let me learn more, and then I just completely lost interest because I found that what I was discovering from people actually really using these languages in the past or the present was a lot more stimulating to me than creating something new. But I don't know, if I wrote a book, a novel or something with fictional characters in a fictional universe or setting and might develop a conlang based off of that, that could be really interesting. I mean, that's why Tolkien created Lord of the Rings, just to explain his languages that he wanted to develop for the sake of this the
Right.
fascination. So I could see myself
Yeah, that
doing
was
that
language
potentially, but
first.
yeah.
Yeah, that was language first and fantasy second, as I understand.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'm not a fiction person in general, actually. I can take real, realistic fiction, but for the most part, I live like an almost entirely nonfiction life, and that's gotten just more so as I've gotten older.
Mm.
Um, I have kind of this obsession with putting together timelines and understanding, what happened before what happened at the same time, and so I get onto these kicks where I just read, through a century or something, and just sort of try to go in order. And because of that, and kind of like you said, there's such a richness of actual living languages that I've never been that tempted to just come up with my own. I don't know what I would do with it. But I will say that maybe a place where I almost semi-border conlang is I have what you could call like a personal dialect of Norwegian, which is
Ooh.
idiosyncratic to me, right? I'm not from Norway, um, but I am a Nynorsk user, and Nynorsk is the like alternative written standard Norwegian that's based on Norwegian dialects. Most Norwegian users are dialect speakers. I don't have a native dialect, so and there's no particular reason for me to imitate, like this fjord's dialect or this valley's dialect. So in a sense, when I write in Norwegian, it's kind of just what, like it's consistent, but it's kind of my own personal, just like I like this, I like that. It's the
Like a
Colorado
Greek
Dawson,
Koine, a mix of the
a
dialects.
little bit, yeah.
I love it.
It Who knows exactly what it comes across as, but it's like it's not, so it's not a conlang, but it's a conlect maybe, in a very limited sense. I don't know. That probably doesn't
Nice.
really count. Idiolect. Runvig asks, Luke, did you write a memory book? Is that a memory palace type thing or something different?
It is different. Yeah, I wrote it 4 years ago, and it's just sort of a technique I used like throughout my life to remember stuff. Remember, I don't know, a long number or to memorize something, to memorize text, poems, things like that. And I wrote a little book about it and put on Amazon 4 years ago. It's essentially, I discovered later that other people have used a similar technique. Um, it's just basically building backwards. The book, I think, is more, since that's easy enough to say, oh, yeah, we'll just sort of build backwards and memorize the last part first. And as you slowly move backward, as you move into it, it's easy to remember where you're going. Um, and maybe that's just intuitive to a lot of people, or maybe people have heard that idea because I've heard at least someone else using that technique. I came to it independently, so I made a book about it, but then I found out later, oh, this some other people have discovered this on their own. So I guess the value of the book is to show up until that year how I was using it in flight school and other stuff because you have to memorize a lot of emergency procedures for flight school and um, poems, ancient Latin poems, that kind of thing.
I'll be interested to take a look at that. I sometimes feel like I have a fairly deficient memory, especially about certain things. I can remember patterns well, I can remember timelines well, and then I am god awful at remembering names.
Yeah.
Right. So there's just some things that, like I remember people, but then I have this weird fear, and I think I can probably trace it to awkward events in my childhood. That like even though I know someone's name, I'll be afraid that I've forgotten it.
I've
Right.
had that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
I
You know
had
what I'm
that
talking
too.
about? It's like
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
I know your name is Stephanie, or I think it is, but like the 2% that I'm not sure, like I just don't want to say it and be embarrassed.
I remember
Yeah,
the moment.
that's
It was I was in
you probably
college.
have a
Yeah, I don't even,
we
it might
both
be in
probably
that
have a
book.
moment.
Yeah, I got a moment. Uh, no, I was in. I remember, in college, you get to go to parties, and then I remember not being able to, remember the people's name, the music, or distracted or whatever, and then being in that exact situation and not wanting to ask, "Hey, what's your name?" that you told me already, maybe once or twice. And I remember saying that to I was visiting home, and I remember saying it casually, just telling my dad stuff about whatever and mentioning it. And I remember he was I think he was peeling a pear or something in the sink, and then he was just he was kind of half listening, and then he was like, "Wait a minute, Luke, you're doing all this stuff like languages and things." And he didn't say it like this. Because he doesn't talk like this, but he's like, that don't make no sense. I feel like he might as well have said it that way. Because like, what are you talking about? Come on, of course you can. And he doesn't talk like that. But basically, that's what he said. And then I was like, you're right, Dad. That's stupid. Why can I not? If I could do that, so I decided to make a point in further social encounters like parties and so forth to really think about the person. And I realized what I was doing is when I heard the person's name, I was consciously echoing it in my own mind as many times as I could while they were still speaking, and I was looking at them in order to prevent that from happening. And now I'm a little bit better. And then I also got the confidence to, like, I might ask, "Oh, how do you spell that?" or
Yeah, sure.
how do you pronounce it if it's like an interesting name, like be foreign or something, and like, to catch it in order to, because I think I have a last name that's not easy to pronounce. You did perfectly, by the way. Thanks for that. And
That's it.
and so I don't
I
really.
didn't do the Italian hand gestures though.
No, those are very. Actually, I love how I gesticulate more when I speak Italian and Latin. It's fun. It's and
Who
much
doesn't?
less in Japanese. That's like you know. But yeah, I found that by kind of by realizing, oh, I seem to be not good at this, but probably this isn't actually part of my nature. Maybe it's just some kind of habit, and I can fix it by just developing a different habit to compensate.
Okay, I'll think. I need to think about this. Um, Cameron asks, when did vulgar Latin depart from classical Latin? And I do think that was asked on the previous one, and I missed it. That does look familiar, but it's an excellent question.
That's a
Thoughts on
great.
that?
Yeah, vulgar Latin essentially is a term that's mostly lost its usefulness because it's not because it's not a thing exactly, but mostly because it's so poorly defined and so differently defined that it's come to lose a value because a lot of people, for example, like I have a video where I play a Roman legionary, and he's talking in Latin, which is contemporary to the time. Something I really like studying is studying informal Latin of, say, the first century AD. Like Petronius in his Satyricon has all these wonderful examples of people talking, and they make grammar mistakes that are normal for people of the time, whereas his text doesn't have the same mistakes, which is very interesting. So he's clearly bringing in the way people are normally speaking at the time, but it's still Latin. It's still normal classical Latin with a couple tiny little differences that are like really small. Oh, you use the subjunctive instead of an infinitive. Oh my gosh, it's like barely tiny little stuff that, for the most part, and some interesting vocabulary. It's rich, but it's not like a different language. However, ever since Dante, and I'd say probably before, there's been this very medieval idea that Dante had, which was in that world, you don't see languages, society, nothing's really changing in that kind of psychology. So Dante's idea in his really interesting essay, which he wrote in Latin called De Vulgaria Eloquentia, about the vulgar the common people's eloquence, where he talks about we need to start writing literature in our own language, the language that we grow up with our nursemates, and stop doing like Virgil did. Whereas, because Virgil also, he doubtlessly spoke the Mantuan language, which is a dialect, considered a dialect. It's another Romance language, which I don't know how many people speak it today. But no, doubtless but of course he spoke that. He didn't speak Latin. So the idea that Latin wasn't really a native language to anyone, even in ancient times, was prevalent in Dante's period. So he was like, hey, let's finally change after 1,300 years of what we're doing. And he convinced it, which actually ties into the whole reason that Italian, Spanish, and the other Romance languages are these different entities now, because they really wanted to cultivate something separate from Latin. Whereas with Greek, they essentially have never, until the 20th century, very consciously sought to depart from the ancient language. And that kind of that break that almost didn't really happen ever in the Greek one. So that idea is still actually rather prevalent. So when I did that video with a Roman legionary, other examples, people say, oh, are you speaking classical Latin or vulgar Latin? Or they'll say, wouldn't this character speak vulgar Latin? What is that like? Or when I did the Ecolinguist video, people asked, are you speaking vulgar Latin? Basically, it's a term which doesn't have any meaning, because when we go back to that period, first century AD through first century BC through second century AD, classical Latin, what we understand it to be is simply the written language of all those authors. And that's what we cultivate and learn and study and learn how to speak. But we have within those authors like Petronius, as well as inscriptions, engravings, Pompeii, we can already see different changes, pronunciation things. We can see a confusion of B and V is happening in the first century AD. Year 13, first evidence for it. Yobe instead of Yobe. Um, and DB instead of
That's
DB.
early.
It is early.
And it
It's
doesn't.
really cool.
It doesn't.
It's African.
Cicero quote some vernacular pronunciations that are a little bit different from classical.
Yes, he does. It's very interesting. He talks about, actually, he uses them. He talks about rustic Latin and rustic non-urban Latin, as in the other Italic languages. The change of I diphthong into e and oi diphthong into e had already happened in rustic Latin, which is interesting because rustic pronunciations end up in urban Latin at an early enough period where, are you familiar with that Italian has 7 standard vowel qualities?
I suppose not.
Yeah, so there's a difference between closed e and open e, closed u and open o in Italian, and some other Romance varieties, but standard Italian preserves it. And one of them is the word for a code, which is codice. It's a closed o, but it comes from the word gaudex. We'd expect it to be open like the word for thing, which is cosa in standard Italian, and it's not cosa in standard Italian, it's cosa, it's open, o. And it's that because it's from causa, the cause, causa, which is a word just like the things, and just like the Norse thing. And yet it happened. And what that demonstrates is with that, and also the word for tail, which is coda, not cauda, it's from cauda in Latin. We can see that in that classical period, that there was this influence of rustic Latin, probably people from countryside living in the city, which changed a few words into that monophthong in order to create a closed vowel in the modern languages. So there is some interesting cross-pollination that's happening even in that early period, but not for the majority of words. So yeah, Cicero does talk about that, which is really, really interesting. And yeah, so what is vulgar Latin at all? Really, it could be the Vulgate Bible, which is basically classical Latin with the fact that they don't have accusative plus infinitive anymore, and some other small changes. That could be vulgar Latin. The vulgar Latin could be what's written in the inscriptions in Pompeii, which are in perfect hexameters, perfect, beautiful ancient poetry. But they're just talking about, stuff that happens in the brothel or whatever. Sometimes they're not all vulgar things, but they're all, because vulgus, and that means the people, the common people is the idea, or actually not even the common people, just means the people, vulgus. But it gets this idea, which is why, just like the word, if I'm not mistaken, Germanic language is better. The word mean in modern English is, brutish and, not nice, but it comes from the word for poor, I think, right? A few centuries ago, that kind of change.
Yeah, well, it's low. Yeah, something
low. Yeah.
which
Yeah,
can be low in an economic sense. Yeah.
like humble. The old like
Huh.
in humilis in Latin
Yeah.
only means low. It doesn't mean like morally humble or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and most of what I've ever seen the term vulgar Latin used for um, is in trying to explain places where, as you mentioned, with some of these old diphthongs becoming monophthongs, uh, in a different quality than you'd expect. Basically, using vulgar Latin to explain places where the Romance languages don't agree with classical Latin as their immediate ancestor.
Mm.
But now it seems like most philologists that I see write about it call that proto-Romance,
Yeah.
which is like this
Much better.
like side by side thing with classical Latin that's actually probably just a later layer, really, of the same language. Um, yeah, it's all languages have registers, and I think that we have such a, and this is something you might have a interesting comment about, but I think that we have such a, what's the word? We put so much prestige on Latin, whether or not we engage with it, that there's kind of this sense that, well, Latin has to be something high, right? So if you're writing something low in Latin, that must be something different from the language of Cicero in some way we can put a label on.
And interestingly, that cultivation is somewhat baked in, for good or ill, because some more severe people who use Latin actively, I say severe in the neutral sense. I'm not criticizing their point of view, but they would say, yeah, it should only like they don't even like wouldn't use stuff from Petronius or Apuleius or a couple of my favorite authors, because it's outside of Caesar and Cicero, which is that gold standard. Like what we call Latin today is like Cicero and Caesar do no wrong. That is, anything that they've done is absolutely Latin and can and should be the model that we use. But then when you get into poetic stuff of like maybe it's Horace or something, like he's inventing some stuff, so maybe you shouldn't use that word. And of course, like I mean, this is really picky, and it becomes really silly to debate about that, but people do. It's interesting though because we seek to maintain to be that link in the chain, right? To some degree, we want to be able to um, connect the ancient with the now. So we don't want to create a modern Romance language out of it. We don't want to change it.
Mm.
We don't want it to evolve. We don't necessarily. I think modern Hebrew is fantastic, but it's definitely different from classical Hebrew, from biblical Hebrew. So some people will say there's really no desire or need to make this a truly living language. It can be a dead language which is still used for communication. Because if we have a native population that's monolingual, it will change. And then eventually, I mean, would you force them to not make up stuff? When we make up stuff, should we do it in a certain model? So I mean, that's the exact thing you're talking about of like, what is this thing Latin? Well, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, and I think you see some interesting kind of counter examples with living languages that try hard in their cultural traditions to stay unchanging, right? So, Icelandic is a good example of this, where there's so many neologisms for every technological thing. I mean, a smartphone is a fars, or a cell phone is farsimi, smartphone is snyartsimi. Computer's tolva. French tries to do this to some extent, right? Instead of don't say le email, which
Yep.
is all really it's funny because you can only kind of do that with Latin because it's dead, right? It's the community of speakers who are going to decide what you call it, and the community of speakers is fine saying le mail, but that's what
Yeah.
it's going to be, whether you want it to be or not. Um, and Andrew here says, in a way, modern English has taken the place of classical Latin in this sense. Vulgar Latin is classical Latin, for example, an Essex accent is to English. Um, and I think that some science fiction writers have projected that into the future, right? So I think in like Orson Scott Card's future novels, there's Stark, which is English internationalized and kind of codified as just this thing that everybody learns to communicate with people from other countries. But then English still exists as its own living tradition among people who are English speakers in the UK or the US, right?
Hmm.
But it's something different from Stark, the internationalized version, which is kind of more of like a classical Latin analog, I guess. At least classical Latin is used in the Middle Ages.
Wow, that's a really cool idea.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We have other questions right now. You said you still have a few minutes.
I do.
Other questions, remarks, or praise?
Critiques. What?
Well, I think it's
They haven't criticized my adoption of the voiceless hua, which I started doing Shakespearean original pronunciation stuff a few years ago, and learning more about English phonology and stuff like that. And because I concentrate so much on these tiny little accent pronunciation things that say Latin, like the difference between first century BC and first century AD, which are these tiny little things of differences that I try to do, I found myself, yeah, I can do hua. And hearing the Irish do like Annie instead of any, I started doing that. So people should feel welcome to criticize my bizarre learned pronunciations of phone names that are not in my native version of English.
well. This is your conlang.
That is my conlang. You're right.
Oh, I come by hua honestly as well as other things.
You do come by it
Andre says,
honestly. We all respect you for it.
thank you. Not everyone actually respects you for it. Andre says Esperanto. I don't know. Do you have a remark on Esperanto?
I have a video which I put on another channel where I just point like little meme-ish videos. I don't know if you're a Simpsons fan, but there's a Halloween episode where the two aliens come to be the candidates for president in the 90s, and they
I do remember this. Yeah.
yeah, and they say it's a two-party system. You have to vote for one of us. And then there's Ross Perot, who's down on the steps of the Capitol, and he just puts his hand through his hat and meh. And the meme is I just put the word Esperanto on him, and I titled the video something that wasn't complimentary to Esperanto. I learned though, because Esperanto is easy enough to just kind of listen to and understand it and even read, that the Esperanto speaking community, which is much faster than I had imagined, didn't take kindly to that, and they told me off in Esperanto. So
Isn't it popular in China or something for some reason?
I don't know. No, I
Guess I've
guess
heard that.
I suppose because what's so nice about Esperanto is that it was created to bring peace for a man where in his community it was this device of four different languages, people who all hated each other, and the language was obviously part of that obstacle, which prevented there being peace in his community. So he thought like, hey, we can if we all speak the same language, which isn't connected to national ties, that's easy enough for at least Western Europeans to pick up. Then we should do it. So I do. Once I learned more about it, I realized, oh, this is a really noble effort. I'm not very fond of the result because I don't like the phonology very much or the mixing of chimeras of vocabulary. It's like, but we already have international language, and we have these really cool ancient languages that I don't know. So I'm not moved by it, but if people are, I think they should enjoy it and pursue it.
Yeah, I respect it, but sort of like with conlangs, I prefer the history of real languages. But I guess it's gone on long enough that it has its own history. I do remember this Simpsons episode. You must choose Gregor or Croc or whatever their names are. What if I vote third party? Go ahead, throw your vote away.
That was my yeah.
I
I think the joke was maybe made in poor taste, and in retrospect, because I didn't want to. I was just I don't know. I just thought it was being funny. Whatever. That's what happens.
no joke is in poor taste. But in connection with that, Ron Vegas, does the number of jokes increase the more languages you learn, or at some point do you grow up and come to terms with the fact that everything is innuendo somewhere?
I think there's more jokes, and my favorite part about learning to speak another language is being able to tell a joke in the foreign language such that native speakers laugh at it. I think that's like you win. That's like you. That's you got it.
Yeah, that's a big test. And rough on my sense of humor. Because I guess my jokes, if I know a language well enough, I guess my jokes work well in any of them. But Apparently, I don't have facial expressions, so if you add the extra complication of another language, my humor apparently translates less well even than in English. Oh well.
Well, I think no, of course you have facial expressions. I don't know. People say that?
I've heard that, yeah. Um,
Such as the internet.
so, yes. Oh well, and more than the internet sometimes. Stitch asked when we're going to do another crowdcast, and we ought to. Actually, I'd like to.
Yeah,
We can talk
absolutely. Oh, it'd be my
more
pleasure.
language learning stuff.
Yeah.
Well, mine too. Should we let you get off to your live stream?
All right. Well, we'll do that. But Dr. Jackson Crawford, I'm absolutely floored by this opportunity. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it since I've been a fan of you for so many years now.
Well, it's great to meet you. I mean, I think you're doing the best work on YouTube right now. It's
Oh,
been
I
it's
feel
been
the same about
excellent to
you,
actually
sir.
meet you internet face to face. Well, let's do this again, and hopefully sooner rather than later. And for now, hold
Oh wait. Oh wait. No, hold on.
on.
Your hat looks better than
Like
mine now.
speed up whole thing. Oh, this hat is probably 50 years old. All right. Well, for now, I wish you the best.